was only established into here, right? So we're just going to push them over here where we're not here yet. But as soon as we get here, where are we going to push them? Pretty soon we're going to push them into the ocean if we can. We'll talk way more about that later. But anyway, that was Jackson's thought. Let's move all these Native Americans or Indians who are primitive people in his mind, let's move them all west of the Mississippi. So if I walked into New Orleans and said, you know, I think you kids are just kind of primitive, I'll tell you what we're going to do. We're going to move you south of Casper. That's what we don't care if your families have lived here forever. We don't care if you have an established home, brothers and sisters, parents. We're just going to move you south of Casper because that's a good place for you down there. Get out of our way. That'd be the same thought. Okay. Now, because of Jackson's beliefs of moving Indians, he encouraged Congress to pass what would be known as the Indian Resettlement Act of 1830. Indian Resettlement Act of 1830. The most criminal act I can think of when we start talking about Native Americans. This is a horrible act. Indian Resettlement Act of 1830. And basically what that act stated is that Indians would be removed to lands where? West of the Mississippi. And Congress would eventually call this Indian Territory. So they're just going to all move west of the Mississippi into Indian Territory that Congress will establish later on. So the Indian Resettlement Act of 1830 simply provided for the removal of Indian tribes that were living east of the Mississippi River to move them all west of the Mississippi River. And you can imagine at first many Indian tribes resisted that, right? They didn't just say, okay, that's great. We'll just head right over there. They resisted. Now, the first notable resistance by Indians was by the Sauk and Fox Indians of southern Wisconsin and northern Illinois. Southern Wisconsin. These Indian tribes were located in this area. Take a look at the map, which were east of the Mississippi. And they were told to move west of the Mississippi, and they resisted doing that. They resisted. Well, in 1832, military forces moved in against those two tribes in what became known as the Black Hawk War. So, when the Sauk and Fox Indians of southern Wisconsin and northern Illinois resisted the Indian Resettlement Act, in 1932, military forces were sent to that area in a conflict that would be called the Black Hawk War. Well, Indian Chief Black Hawk and his Indian followers from both tribes fought bravely and skillfully against the military, but they were soon overwhelmed and were forced to move into Indian territory west of the Mississippi. But that was the first conflict between American military forces and Native American tribes concerning the Indian Resettlement Act of 1830, when Indian Chief Black Hawk and his Indian followers from both those tribes fought bravely and skillfully against the military, but they were overwhelmed and forced to move. Well, there were tribes, especially in Georgia, Florida, Alabama, and Mississippi, who decided if you can't beat them, join them. And they simply adopted the white man's way of life. So in Georgia, in Florida, in Alabama, and in Mississippi, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, and Mississippi, many tribes decided to adopt the white man's way of life. Can't beat them, join them. And among those tribes were once very powerful Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Cherokee, and Seminole Indians, which I put on your ID sheet. So we'll repeat that a couple of times so you can get it. So, meanwhile, in Georgia, Florida, Alabama, and Mississippi, many tribes adopted the white man's way of life. Among those tribes were once very powerful Creek Indians, Choctaw Indians, Chickasaw Indians, Cherokee Indians, and Seminole Indians. Those 5 tribes, the Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Cherokee, and Seminole, once they tried to adopt the white man's way of life, they became known as what? Those 5 tribes. The 5 civilized tribes. You ever watch the outlaw Josie Wales? Anybody seen that? That old Indian guy that's with Josie Wales, he'll make a reference to the 5 civilized tribes. Okay? So, that's what they were, the 5 civilized tribes. Well, by the end of 1833, 3 of those 5 civilized tribes signed removal treaties with the federal government, which meant they agreed to move west of the Mississippi. And the 3 tribes that agreed to do that, of those 5, were the Creek, Choctaw, and Chickasaw. They agreed and signed removal treaties with the federal government stating they would willingly move west of the Mississippi onto Indian lands. They were the Creeks, Choctaws, and Chickasaws, which left which 2 Indian tribes that refused to sign? Now keep in mind, they tried to adopt the white man's way of life, but they were not interested in what? Moving. Who were they? Cherokee and the Seminoles. Okay? So again, all 5 civilized tribes were adopting the white man's way of life, but only the Creeks and Choctaws and Chickasaws agreed to sign an agreement that they would move west. The Seminoles and the Cherokee did not want to move. They said, hey, we'll stay here and adopt the white man way of life, but we don't want to move. Well, when the Seminoles and Cherokee Indians refused to sign that removal treaty, it led to the Seminole War and the famous Trail of Tears. Famous Trail of Tears. So when the Seminoles and Cherokee Indians refused to sign the removal treaty, it led to what was known as the Seminole War and the infamous Trail of Tears. Now, this Seminole War lasted almost a decade. It lasted, they fought back and forth until 1842. 1842. And when the Seminoles were finally defeated by the American military, they were moved westward. Now, this isn't yet the Trail of Tears. We'll talk about that in a minute. Because what specific tribe was that involved? The Cherokee. So we're talking about the Seminole War. And the Seminoles were finally defeated by the American military. And after they were defeated, they moved westward with the exception of a small number of Indians who hid where in Florida. They escaped the movement west and hid where in Florida? A lot of alligators there. A lot. The Florida Everglades, where their descendants are still there. They still have descendants from the Seminole tribe. Florida State Seminoles. That's where the name comes from. Not from the people that escaped, but from the Seminole tribe in Florida. But when they moved the Seminoles west of the Mississippi, some escaped and hid in the Florida Everglades, and they still have descendants of that in the Everglades today. Okay, let's talk about the fate of the Cherokee Indians. Let's talk about the fate of the Cherokee Indians. Now I'm going to give you some examples of how they tried like crazy to adapt to the white man's way of life. They were a very organized tribe. Very organized. Certainly could have survived on their own east of the Mississippi. But they refused to sign that treaty. But they were very organized. You know, they had developed their own written language. Not a lot of Indian tribes have their verbal language, but not a written language. They even published a newspaper in their own language. They even had schools for their children. These people were organized, these Cherokee. They were trying their best to survive in a white man's world. They developed a written language. They even published a newspaper in their own language. They even supported schools for their children. They even had their own constitution. They had laws, they had law enforcement, they had a judicial system. I mean, these guys were organized. They wanted to do it in their own culture, but they were trying to civilize themselves. Does that make sense? Think about that, okay? They had a written language. They had a newspaper written in their own language. They allowed their kids to go to school, which wasn't something that others did. They even had their own written constitution, which included their own laws, their own law enforcement, and their own judicial system. And maybe they'd have left the Cherokee tribe alone in Georgia, but what was discovered there that made the push even more important? Gold. So when gold was discovered in Georgia, white settlers wanted to swarm in there in search of gold, and the pressure was back on the Cherokee to do what? Sign the removal treaty, which they refused to do. So, unfortunately for the Cherokee tribe, gold was discovered in Cherokee land in Georgia. As a result, white settlers looked to swarm the area in search of gold, and the government tried to force the tribe to sign a removal treaty. And which government forced them to sign, tried to force them to sign it? Was the federal government that did this when gold was discovered in Georgia, or who was it? What's that? The state government. So, this is really important you understand. The government of Georgia was the one that tried to force the tribe to sign the removal treaty. When they refused to sign that, the government of Georgia threatened to seize those Cherokee lands, to take their land from them. So picture this in your mind. They find gold. The Georgia government tries to force these Cherokee into signing the removal treaty. They say no. They say, if you don't sign it, we're going to seize your land. Well, the Cherokee tribe was organized people. So what did they do? Where did they appeal that decision to seize their land to? All the way to where? The Supreme Court. So the Cherokee tribe appealed this, what they considered illegal seizure of their lands, because they wouldn't sign the removal treaty, and they sent that to the Supreme Court. Anybody remember who the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court was at this time? Somebody did a report. John Marshall. John Marshall. Very good. So the Cherokee tribe, who's supposed to be these primitive savages, have enough organization and government within their own tribe that they appealed the illegal seizure of their lands all the way to the Supreme Court under the leadership of Chief Justice John Marshall. What did Marshall rule? What do you anticipate he ruled? For or against those Indians?
Against.
You would think he did. Justice Marshall ruled that the state of Georgia had no jurisdiction over the tribe and no claim to their land. None. So what do you think government officials in Georgia did? Just said, ah, it's okay, I guess we lost. They ignored Marshall's ruling and continued their actions against the Cherokee. Ignored his ruling and continued their actions against the Cherokee. Who got word of this higher up? Who got word of this thing in Georgia that was going on? President Jackson. And when he heard about the Supreme Court ruling, he said angrily, "Mr. Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." What's Jackson saying?
Let Georgia do what they're doing.
That's exactly right. President Jackson refused to enforce from the presidential seat that Supreme Court ruling. And when he heard about it, he said angrily, "Mr. Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." The President of the United States isn't going to make Georgia appeal to that decision. So those Indians are in tough shape. Well, finally, in 1835, Cherokee leaders who are fed up with this whole hassle finally agree to sign the removal treaty. In exchange for signing, they want to be relocated peacefully. We'll sign this treaty, but you have to promise to relocate us west of the Mississippi peacefully. That agreement that was signed between Cherokee leaders and the Georgia government was known as the Treaty of New Echota. Treaty of New Echota. And this agreement with the Cherokee tribe stated that they would be willing to move west of the Mississippi as long as they were relocated peacefully. Well, one Cherokee chief in particular, John Ross, resisted the Removal Act to the bitter end. He resisted it to the bitter end. So did some of the Cherokee move west, as told by result of this treaty? Yes, they did. John Ross and his followers refused and resisted the entire time. As a result of their resistance, approximately 20,000 Cherokee men, women, and children were relocated west by gunpoint. Not peacefully, by gunpoint, because they would not sign. So as a result of this resistance to sign the treaty and abide by it, John Ross and his 20,000 men, women, and children were relocated westward at gunpoint. They were marched from Georgia to lands west of the Mississippi in the middle of the winter. In the middle of the dead winter. Which resulted in 25% of that tribe dying on the march. 25%. So the Cherokee tribe was marched to the Indian Territory in the middle of the winter, resulting in nearly 25% of the tribe perishing along the way. And this sad march became known in American history as the Trail of Tears. I'm going to tell you why. It's kind of an interesting story. According to Indian legend, the state flower of Virginia grew in every spot that a tear fell during the Trail of Tears. Think about that. According to Indian legend, the state flower of Georgia, one flower grew where every tear fell on the Trail of Tears. Anybody know what the state flower of Georgia is called? Here's a picture of it. Anybody know what that's called? It's called the Cherokee Rose. The Cherokee Rose. And according to Indian legend, the Cherokee Rose, this rose, which is very abundant along that trail they took, according to legend of the Indian legend, one Cherokee rose rose where every tear fell during that famous Trail of Tears. Okay? All right. We're going to stop there today, and I'm going to give you a little handout. I want you to read through this and complete it. It will be due Friday at the start of the period. This is the decision that was made by John Marshall concerning the Supreme Court decision, which was called Worcester versus Georgia. So I want you to read through this, work on it. You can work on it together in Orange Period or whatever you'd like. Just make sure you have this thing completed. We will hand it in Friday at the start of the period. And it's about that Supreme Court decision that we talked about. Make sure everybody gets one. I don't know if I counted correctly.
Mr.
Yes. gonna go? See you later. So read through this and answer the question on, 2 questions on the back. You can work on it together. Need 2 more? 2 more? Okay, you don't have one either?
Yeah, I don't have
Where are you gonna be? We'll just turn it back. There's more coming. All right, how many don't have them? You have one? You need one here? JC, you need one? You need one, Dave? Okay, we're short 3. Okay, I'll be back.
Caitlin, do you want to get together sometime and do inventory? When is it here? Yeah. Remember when Riley was talking to me? Yeah, you were there right before we left for break. She was like, prom stuff came in. Oh, I thought
She wants us to go and check, like open up all the boxes and check everything out.
Yeah.
She says she thinks there's still more stuff.
I'm sure there is. I'm sure it's all there.
And it's in between. What is it?
I can't do it. I'm not doing it.
Okay, who else needs one? Josh? Okay. Yeah, if you're gonna be gone Friday, turn them in before you go. Maybe we'll just make them do Thursday. That'd be easier. We'll make them do Thursday, start of the period.
Oh yeah, I probably won't be here Friday. I don't know. I don't even know where we're going.
Okay, we'll have it due Thursday. Everybody got that Thursday, start of the period.